evening was quiet, a soft, cool breeze drifting through the open window, carrying with it the faint scent of rain from earlier in the day. It was that time just after the sun has set when the world seems to hold its breath, the air thick with calm. The house was still, except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath me. I sat comfortably in my favorite chair, the warm glow of a table lamp casting gentle light across the room. It was one of those peaceful, ordinary nights where the darkness outside felt far away, separated by the walls of the house. But as the minutes passed, there was something about the stillness, something about the quiet that began to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a slight shift in the atmosphere, as if the air itself had thickened, pressing in just a little more than usual. I could hear the soft flutter of the curtains in the wind, the faintest rustle as if someone was brushing past them. My thoughts wandered, the calmness of the night easing my mind, but just as quickly as the calmness had settled in, I heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft at first, so subtle, that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then, just as I was about to settle back into the quiet, I heard it again. This time it was clearer, my name. I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty, still as ever. And yet, the air seemed heavier now, the kind of quiet that makes you question whether you're truly alone. The faintest of whispers, that subtle intrusion into the stillness, had shifted something inside me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one there. That quiet, unassuming moment held something unsettling, something I couldn't place, and as the night wore on, I couldn't help but wonder if I was alone at all. It was one of those quiet, cold evenings where the world outside felt like it was held in suspension. The kind of evening where the chill in the air seeps into everything, even when you're inside. I had just moved into a small house on the edge of town, nothing too fancy, just an old two-story with creaky floors and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. I'd always liked old houses, the kind with character, even if they came with a few imperfections. I was settling in, unpacking boxes, organizing things, trying to make the house feel like home. The house felt empty at first, silent in a way that was almost oppressive, like it was waiting for something. The warmth from the space heater in the living room made the air feel a little more comfortable, but even so, there was something about the quiet that made the house feel distant, separate. It had been a long day, and I was grateful to be alone, the solitude a relief after the chaos of moving. It wasn't until later that night, after I had dinner and finished putting away the last of the kitchen items, that I began to notice something strange. I was sitting on the couch, my legs tucked under a blanket, when I heard it. A soft sound, barely perceptible at first. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, like someone shifting in the next room. I thought it was the wind at first, maybe a branch brushing against the window. But when I listened more carefully, I realized it wasn't that. The sound was too soft, too deliberate. It sounded like someone was moving, walking through the hallway outside the living room. I paused, my hand resting on the arm of the couch, unsure if I had actually heard it. The house was old and there were always odd noises, settling, shifting in the night, but this was different. This wasn't the usual creaking I'd grown used to. It was a movement, a step, almost followed by silence. I shrugged it off, dismissing it as my imagination. It had been a long day and I was probably just tired. The house was still settling after all. I grabbed my phone, distracted myself by scrolling through messages, trying to ignore the creeping unease in the back of my mind. But then it happened again, a faint sound, this time closer, like a soft footfall in the hall right outside the living room. I froze, my thumb pausing over the screen. I wasn't imagining it. There it was again, the lightest shuffle, as if someone was standing just out of view. My heartbeat picked up, but I told myself it was nothing. I was alone, of course, and the house was empty. I stood up, checked the windows, and glanced down the hallway. There was nothing there, just darkness stretching out toward the kitchen, a small patch of moonlight slipping through the curtains. Everything seemed fine, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up now. I tried to shake it off and return to the couch, pulling the blanket tighter around me. But the quiet was oppressive, heavy. I tried to relax, but the sensation of being watched lingered. The air in the room felt colder now, a subtle change that I couldn't ignore. I glanced around the room, the corners of the walls swallowing up the shadows. Everything was exactly as it had been before, yet the silence had a weight to it, like the house was holding its breath. My eyes flicked to the hallway again, where the faintest shadow seemed to stretch in the corner of my vision. But when I looked directly at it, it was gone. The air was still. I was about to grab the remote and turn on the TV when it came again. This time it wasn't a sound, it was a whisper, soft like someone calling my name, barely audible, just on the edge of my hearing. I could feel my stomach twist in a way that made me go still. I didn't move for a long moment, my eyes locked on the hallway, my mind racing through explanations. It had to be the house. There were old pipes, old wiring, there had to be an explanation, but the voice. The whisper sounded so clear, so personal, like it was right next to me. My name. I could feel it on my skin, the chill of it, the presence that came with it. My breath caught and I turned toward the hallway again, my chest tight. I couldn't be sure, but I thought I saw a figure standing there. It was just a flicker, like a shadow moving across the floor and then nothing. The air was heavy, thicker somehow, pressing in around me. I stood, my legs trembling as I walked toward the hallway. It was dark now, darker than before, but there was no sound, no movement. I called out softly, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. No answer. Just the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me. I felt foolish, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I slowly stepped into the hallway, my steps careful, the floor creaking underfoot. I turned toward the stairs where the shadows grew deeper, almost like they were waiting. I felt drawn to them, the way the darkness seemed to gather there, thick and inviting. But the house was silent now. The whisper was gone. I stood at the foot of the stairs, trying to steady my breathing, but my heart was pounding so loudly that it almost drowned out the quiet around me. I turned on the hallway light, illuminating the stairs, the landing above. Nothing was there. No one was there. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I had imagined it all. The silence was deafening now, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to leave. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just been standing there, watching me. The air was still cold, though the temperature hadn't dropped. As I stepped back into the living room slowly, cautiously, and sank down on the couch again. My eyes flickered to the hallway once more, and for a moment I thought I saw something shift just out of the corner of my eye. But when I looked, nothing was there. The house was still. It was only then that I realized how deeply quiet it had become. Too quiet. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I never felt completely at ease. That quiet, that whisper, it lingered. It followed me as I tried to settle back into the normal routine of my evening. And when I finally went to bed, I couldn't help but leave the light on, the shadows in the corners of the room feeling just a little too close. I lay there for hours, staring into the dark, trying not to listen for the whisper that I knew might come again. And it did, just before I drifted off, barely audible, just a whisper, my name. It was a warm, clear evening when I decided to take my usual walk through the forest. The kind of evening where the sun hangs low in the sky, casting long shadows on the earth and painting everything in a soft, golden hue. The air was still, the kind of stillness that fills you with a quiet sense of peace. The trees were thick with leaves, their branches swaying slightly in the gentle breeze, and the path I followed was well worn from years of use. I had walked this trail countless times before, and each time I found a certain comfort in the repetition. The rhythm of the walk, the crunch of my boots on the dirt, and the rustle of the leaves around me created a feeling of serenity, as though I was stepping into a space that belonged only to me. As I walked deeper into the forest, I noticed how the light began to change. The sun had almost dipped below the horizon now, leaving only a faint orange glow behind the trees. The shadows grew longer and the air began to cool. It wasn't an uncomfortable cold, just a shift, the temperature dropping slightly as evening settled in. The forest felt different at this hour, quieter somehow, as if the world outside was fading away and the woods were reclaiming everything. I had always found solace in the quiet, the way the forest seemed to breathe with you, but tonight there was something else in the air, something I couldn't quite place. A weight almost like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I continued on, trying to shake off the feeling, focusing on the sounds around me, the call of a bird in the distance, the rustling of leaves in the wind. But then, just as I was rounding a bend in the trail, I heard something strange. At first, it was so soft that I almost missed it, just a faint sound drifting through the trees. It sounded like a voice, but it wasn't clear enough to make out any words. I stopped in my tracks, straining my ears to listen. The wind had picked up slightly, and I couldn't tell if the sound was just the wind or something else. I waited for a moment, the world around me still, before I heard it again. This time it was clearer, a whisper, but it was so soft that I had to lean in to catch it. My name, barely audible, seemed to float through the air, hanging there for a moment before it was gone. I stood still, my heart suddenly beating faster. I looked around, my eyes scanning the trees, but there was no one in sight. The path ahead of me was empty, the forest stretching out in every direction, silent but for the wind. It was probably nothing, I told myself, just the wind playing tricks. The forest was full of sounds that could easily be mistaken for something else, especially at dusk when the light plays tricks on your eyes. But the whisper had sounded too clear, too intentional, like someone had actually called my name. I took a few steps forward, trying to shake off the unease that was starting to creep up my spine. But then, just as I was about to resume my walk, I heard it again. This time it was louder, more distinct, and it came from behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I turned quickly, but there was no one there, just the trees, the path, and the dimming light of the evening. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady myself, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe it was just the wind again, or my mind playing tricks in the fading light. But the voice, the whisper, it was too clear, too real to ignore. I glanced over my shoulder one more time, but the trail was empty as it should have been. I turned back around and continued walking, my pace quicker now, as if somehow moving faster would shake off the feeling of being watched. The whispering voice had unsettled me, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once as I walked. The forest felt different now, darker, the shadows stretching longer and deeper between the trees. I couldn't help but feel that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone anymore. The familiar trail now seemed strange, the trees closing in, the path narrowing as if the forest was drawing me deeper. The air was colder now, and the rustling of the leaves in the wind sounded louder, almost frantic, as if something was moving just beyond my sight. I stopped again, this time on purpose, listening carefully. The whispering came again, but this time it wasn't just a voice. It was multiple voices, all calling my name in soft, overlapping whispers as though the trees themselves were speaking to me. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the urgency in them, the way they seemed to circle around me. My heart began to race, and I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was just the wind, I told myself again. There was no one here. The forest was just playing tricks, just like it always did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, something watching me from the shadows. I turned back, deciding to leave the trail to return to the safety of the clearing near my house. The whispering had stopped for the moment, but the unease lingered, settling deep in my chest. I walked quickly, my footsteps heavy on the dirt path, but I didn't look back. As I neared the edge of the forest where the trees began to thin, I heard it again. A soft, distant whisper calling my name once more. This time, though, I didn't stop. I kept walking, faster now, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice seemed to follow me, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the trees. I finally reached the clearing, and without a second thought, I hurried back to the house, locking the door behind me. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every shift in the air felt like the whispering was still there, waiting for me just outside the window. I lay in bed wide awake, listening to the silence of the house, but the unease never left me. The whisper in the forest had followed me inside, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, I knew deep down that something had been there, something that wanted me to hear its voice. Even now, whenever I walk through that forest, I hear it again, the whispering voice, soft and insistent, just out of reach. Sometimes it sounds like my name, sometimes it's something else. But it's always there, waiting for me to listen. And I wonder if next time it will be something more than just a voice. It was one of those rare moments when our whole family gathered together, no distractions, no outside commitments. Just a quiet evening at my aunt's house, the kind of family get-together where everyone comes together to catch up, eat, and share stories. The house itself was old, with creaky floors and a soft, homely smell of cinnamon and candles that filled every room. It wasn't huge, but it had always felt warm, like a place that held memories in every corner. I remember sitting in the living room, surrounded by my cousins, my parents, and my aunt. Laughter filled the space, the clink of silverware against plates, the sound of my aunt bustling around the kitchen. It was just another evening, just another ordinary night, nothing unusual about it at all. The evening passed in the usual manner, everyone chatting and reminiscing. At one point, the conversation turned to old family stories, the kind you hear every year but never tire of. The sound of voices blended together in the background as I listened half-heartedly, staring out the window at the soft orange glow of the setting sun. The air felt comfortable, the evening warm against the chill of the autumn night. It wasn't until the conversation quieted down that I noticed it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible at first. It was a soft whisper, too quiet to be heard clearly, but there nonetheless. I couldn't tell where it had come from, but it wasn't just in my head, I was certain of that. It felt like someone had spoken my name, barely audible, just enough to catch my attention. I paused, my fork halfway to my mouth, listening intently. But when I looked around, no one seemed to notice anything unusual. I shook it off, thinking it was just a trick of the mind, perhaps the sound of a passing car outside or a draft moving through the house. But the feeling didn't leave me. I continued eating, but the quiet unease lingered, hovering in the back of my mind. And then, a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was clearer, my name faint but unmistakable. It wasn't my parents or anyone else at the table. It was too soft to be anyone from the conversation, but it was there in the air, hanging in the space between the sounds of the room. The whisper felt close, almost as though it was coming from behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. I felt my skin prickle with unease. I looked around the room, but no one seemed to be paying attention to anything other than their own conversations. I cleared my throat, pretending I hadn't heard it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. It could have been anything, I told myself. The house creaked after all, and old houses do strange things, but the whisper didn't feel like the house settling. It felt different, personal, like it was meant only for me. The next few moments passed in a blur, my mind occupied by that whisper. I tried to focus on the conversation around me, the familiar faces of my cousins and relatives laughing and chatting, but the weight of what I had heard pulled at me. It wasn't like any normal whisper. It wasn't the kind of sound that you could easily dismiss. It felt intentional, like something had spoken just to me from somewhere close by. I pushed my unease aside and forced myself to rejoin the conversation, but as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The air in the room had changed, growing slightly colder, and though the lights were on, the room suddenly felt darker, as if the shadows had deepened in the corners. I could still hear my family talking, but their voices began to sound distant, muffled, as though the room was closing in around me. My own heartbeat seemed louder now, and I felt the weight of the silence creeping in as the minutes passed. Well, then it happened again. This time the whisper wasn't just my name, it was more distinct. I could hear the words clearly, soft, but sharp enough to make my pulse quicken. Come here. The voice wasn't loud, but it wasn't in my head. It was as if someone was standing right beside me, just out of my line of sight, their breath brushing against my ear. I froze. The room seemed to stop for a moment, the laughter from my family fading into the background as I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room. But there was no one close enough to have whispered to me, no one behind me. The air had grown thicker, and the familiar warmth of the room now felt suffocating, like I couldn't breathe properly. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and the cold sensation of being watched settled over me like a blanket. I excused myself from the table, trying to keep my voice steady, and stepped into the hallway. The house felt even quieter now, the hum of conversation muffled by the thick, sudden silence that filled the air. I stood for a moment in the hall, trying to calm myself, but the whispering had unsettled me, making it hard to focus. I wasn't sure what had happened, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural even. My body was tense, my heart still pounding in my chest. The house, which had always been a place of comfort, now felt alien, like it was hiding something I couldn't see. After a few moments, I returned to the dining room, trying to act normal, but everything felt different now. The voices at the table sounded further away, as though I were hearing them through a thick fog. It was as if the room had changed somehow, shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible but unsettling all the same. My family continued talking, unaware of the strange unease that had settled over me, and I sat back down, my hands trembling slightly. I didn't hear the whisper again, but the sense of something being wrong lingered long after the evening ended. The drive home felt longer than usual, the familiar route now seeming strange, the quiet in the car almost oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had spoken to me was still there, following me, waiting for me to listen. That night, I lay in bed, staring into the darkness of my room, the whisper still echoing in my mind. I told myself it was just a trick of the mind, just the imagination running wild, but deep down, I knew that the voice I had heard wasn't just in my head. It was too real, too deliberate, as if someone or something had wanted me to hear it. Even now, I still wonder what it was. Was it a family member playing a prank, a figment of my imagination fueled by the exhaustion of the day? Or was it something else, something older, more persistent, that still lingers in the shadows, waiting for me to hear it again? I can't say for sure. But every time I visit that house, every time I sit down with my family, I feel the weight of that moment, that whisper following me just out of sight, just beyond the corner of my mind. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon when I decided to finally tackle the attic. I had been meaning to clean it out for weeks, but the thought of sorting through old boxes filled with forgotten things always felt like too much. The house I had moved into was old, a little rundown, and definitely had its quirks. The attic was one of those places that I always ignored, hidden away at the top of the house, sealed off with a heavy wooden door that had never seemed to be bothered by anything. The air up there was always a little musty, a little cooler than the rest of the house. Every time I went upstairs, I'd glance up at the attic door and tell myself I'd get to it eventually. Today felt like the day. The weather outside was overcast, the kind of gray sky that makes everything inside feel a little dimmer. I started with the first box near the bottom of the stairs, opening it to find a mixture of old family photos, worn-out books, and knickknacks that had no real value. I moved methodically, sorting through it all, thinking about the previous owner of the house, the lives that had lived here before me. There was nothing particularly unsettling about the attic, not at first. It was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the house settling under its own weight. The faint smell of dust and old wood was a familiar scent, one I had grown used to since moving in. But as I continued digging through the boxes, I began to notice something odd. It wasn't anything loud or jarring at first. It was a faint sound, a soft rustling, almost like something shifting in the darkness. I paused, my fingers lingering on a dusty photo album, and listened. There it was again, a faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the far corner of the attic. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I turned my head, my heart giving an odd little flutter. The air in the attic felt colder, and for a moment I wondered if I had heard it wrong, just the wind maybe, or a noise from the house settling again. I didn't pay it much attention. The attic was old after all, and old houses have a way of making strange noises. Still, there was something about the whisper that didn't quite sit right with me. I went back to sorting through the boxes, shaking it off, but the whisper came again, a little clearer this time. It was unmistakable, a soft voice so faint that I couldn't make out the words, but my name. My first name, called out quietly as if someone were standing behind me just beyond the light of the small bulb hanging from the rafters. My body tensed. I turned around quickly, half expecting to find someone standing there, but the attic was empty. The shadows were thick, the light barely cutting through the corners of the room. I knew no one else was here. I was alone. My breath caught in my throat for a moment, but I tried to push the unease down. It's nothing, I told myself, just your imagination. But the more I tried to focus on my work, the more the whisper seemed to follow me. It wasn't getting louder, but it felt closer. I tried to ignore it, bury myself in the boxes of forgotten memories. But no matter how hard I focused on the task at hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that attic. The cold, the whisper, everything was just a little off, like the space around me wasn't quite right. It felt like something was there waiting. I stood up and moved toward the far corner of the attic where the whispering seemed to originate. There was a small door in that corner, a narrow thing hidden behind a stack of old furniture and boxes. I hadn't noticed it before. I leaned down to inspect it, feeling an odd shiver crawl up my spine. It wasn't like the rest of the house's doors, it was different. The wood was worn and cracked, the handle old, rusted, like it hadn't been touched in years. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the silence pressing against me. And then, without really thinking, I reached for the handle. The moment my hand touched the rusted metal, I heard it again, the whisper, clearer this time, like a voice in my ear, almost familiar. It was the same voice, the same faint call of my name, but now I could hear it more clearly, as though the person was standing right behind me. My stomach dropped, and I quickly pulled my hand away from the door, feeling a cold sweat break out across my skin. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. Just the same empty attic, the same shadows. The temperature in the attic had dropped noticeably, and I couldn't explain it. My breath was visible now, a faint mist hanging in the air as I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the small door. I felt a compulsion, a strange pull to open it, but something in the pit of my stomach told me not to. The whispering had stopped for now, but the silence was thick, almost suffocating. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, trying to calm my breathing. I knew I was alone in the house. I had checked before I started working in the attic, so why did it feel like I was? I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. I had to know what was behind that door. Slowly, I reached out again, this time more cautiously, my hand trembling slightly. The door creaked when I twisted the handle, the sound of old wood scraping against old metal making my heart race. The door opened just a crack, and I could feel the temperature drop even more, the air now frigid against my skin. Beyond the door, there was nothing but darkness. The dim light from the attic didn't reach far enough to illuminate anything beyond the threshold. It was impossible to see what was inside, and for a moment I just stood there, unsure whether I should open it all the way. That's when I heard it, just above a whisper this time, but unmistakable. "Come in." The voice was soft, but I heard it clearly, right in my ear, as though someone had been standing beside me the entire time. I spun around, panic flooding through me, but again there was nothing, just the dark attic, the stack of boxes, the silence. The weight of the air around me felt suffocating, and I didn't want to be there anymore. I turned and ran, leaving the door ajar, the whisper still echoing in my mind as I descended the stairs back to the rest of the house. I never went back to that attic. I don't know what was behind that door, and part of me doesn't want to know. Every time I walk past it, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was there, whatever spoke to me, is still waiting, silent and patient, just beyond that door. And sometimes, when the house is quiet and I'm alone, I swear I can hear it again, the whisper just faintly, as though it's calling me back. It was a chilly evening in early October when I first heard the whisper. It was one of those quiet nights when the air outside carries the scent of damp leaves and the soft rustling of branches. I had been hanging out with my friend Mark at his apartment, a place I'd visited countless times before. The familiar hum of the fridge and the low sound of traffic outside were comforting, as was the dim light that flickered from the table lamp in the corner. We were sitting on the couch, sharing some pizza and talking about nothing in particular. The kind of conversation where the minutes slip by unnoticed and the world outside feels distant, muffled like a soft cocoon. We had been friends for years, close enough to be comfortable in each other's silence. The atmosphere that evening was easy, light. Mark was on his phone, scrolling through something, and I was absent-mindedly flipping through a book I had been meaning to finish. The quiet was broken only by the occasional clink of my glass against the coffee table or the sound of him laughing at something on his screen. It was calm, familiar, and completely normal. But then, just as I set my book down, ready to join him in whatever he found so amusing, I heard it. A whisper so soft it barely reached my ears. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe the hum of the fridge. But as I paused and looked around, I noticed that the apartment was still, no wind, no breeze. I couldn't see anything out of place. And yet there it was again, a faint whisper, not in my ear but just behind me, close enough to make me freeze. I turned quickly, my heart catching in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice trembled just a little. Mark didn't look up from his phone. "What? Hear what?" he asked, his voice distracted. I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't want to sound foolish, but the whisper had been too clear. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "It was nothing," I told myself, "just your imagination." I tried to shake it off and continue the conversation, but the unease wouldn't leave. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, it felt like someone was standing just out of sight. I told myself it was the dark, the shadows making me feel like I was being watched. The lamp in the corner flickered, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls, and I blamed that for the growing discomfort in my chest. It wasn't until later when we both got up to clean the dishes that it happened again. This time it was louder, clearer, more urgent. "Come here." The voice was unmistakable, soft but compelling. It was Mark. It wasn't anyone I could see. I stood frozen in place, my hands still holding a plate I hadn't yet put down. The whisper was so distinct, it sent a chill crawling up my spine. I spun around, but the apartment was empty, just the same as it had been moments before. Mark was in the kitchen, humming as he washed the dishes, completely unaware. But the voice had been real. It had been as real as anything. "Mark, did you hear that?" I asked again, my voice steadier this time but still carrying the edge of something I couldn't explain. He paused, looking over at me. "Hear what?" he asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. I looked at him and the unease tightened in my chest. What did I hear? I wondered. Am I losing it? I didn't mention it again. I couldn't explain it, but the longer I tried to focus on the normal, mundane things we were doing, the more uncomfortable I became. It wasn't just the whispering voice anymore. It was the feeling of being watched, as if something was standing just behind me, close enough to feel its presence without seeing it. The room had grown colder, and though I told myself it was just the air conditioning, it didn't feel quite right. That night when Mark and I finally settled down to watch a movie, the whispering came back, but this time it was different. It wasn't just one voice. It was multiple, soft murmurs like they were coming from all around me. "Come here. Look, turn around." They were all faint, just above a whisper, but there was a rhythm to them, an urgency that sent my heart pounding in my chest. I felt a coldness spreading from the back of my neck to my shoulders, as if a hand had brushed against me. I jerked around again, my breath quick, but the room was still empty. No one was there. Mark was still sitting next to me, completely unaware of what was happening. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I looked at him, my face pale. I keep hearing something," I said, trying to explain, but I didn't know how. "Whispers. It sounds like someone's talking to me, calling my name." Mark laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, the kind people give when they don't quite know how to react. "Man, you're losing it," he joked, nudging my shoulder. But it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like something was creeping into the room, something that wasn't supposed to be there. My mind raced, trying to reason with myself, but the whispers kept coming. Soft, relentless, like a thread woven into the air around me. I could almost hear them in the corners of the room, just beyond the reach of the light. I excused myself to go to the bathroom, needing a break from the suffocating tension. I stood in front of the mirror, my hands trembling as I washed my face, trying to ground myself. The whispering had stopped, but the feeling of being followed didn't. I couldn't shake it. I stood there, staring at my reflection, the chill creeping down my spine again. When I turned around to leave, the door to the bathroom creaked open by itself, just a fraction, like someone had pushed it. As I froze, the door shouldn't have moved. I hadn't touched it, and Mark was nowhere near me. I could hear his laughter from the other room, but I didn't feel safe walking back out there. The air was too thick, too oppressive. I stepped back slowly, my hand on the doorframe, and when I turned around, I saw it. The shadow. It wasn't on the wall, but it was just behind me, hovering there, too close to the door, too real to ignore. My heart stopped, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't dare look back at it for long, but the whispering voices were still there, louder now, wrapping around me in the silence of the bathroom. When I finally stepped out of the bathroom, Mark was sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to the screen. Everything in the room seemed normal again, the whispers gone, the air back to its usual temperature. But the feeling of something following me, something close behind, stayed with me the rest of the night. When I left Mark's apartment that evening, the cold air outside felt like a relief. I could still hear the whispers faintly, like they were trailing behind me, lingering in the wind. I've never been able to shake the feeling that something else was in the room with us that night, something not of this world, something that wasn't just a trick of the mind. Maybe it was a ghost, or maybe just a figment of my imagination. But I know this. Every time I think about that night, the sound of those whispers is still there, somewhere just out of reach, waiting. And I haven't visited Mark's apartment since. It was an ordinary evening, much like any other. The air was cool, the kind of crisp that you only feel in the fall, and I had just come back home after a long day at work. The house was quiet, eerily so, in fact, considering the bustle of the neighborhood outside. I stepped through the front door, dropped my bag on the chair by the entrance, and kicked off my shoes, letting the familiar silence of the house settle around me. I had recently moved in, an old townhouse tucked away on a quiet street, one of those places that feels like it holds memories in every creaking floorboard and every chipped paint corner. It wasn't the biggest house, but it had character, and I liked it. It felt like home the moment I stepped inside. I took my time getting comfortable, made myself a cup of tea, and curled up on the couch to read. The evening sun filtered in through the window, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, and the soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that filled the room. I liked this quiet. It felt peaceful, a reprieve from the chaos of my day. But even in the stillness, there was something about the house that felt off, not in a dramatic way, just a subtle sense of something being slightly out of place. Maybe it was just the newness of the house, the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the walls settling into their new rhythms. But as I sipped my tea, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. I continued reading, trying to ignore the sense of unease creeping in around the edges of my mind when I first noticed the door. It wasn't anything strange, it was just the door to the spare bedroom tucked away at the end of the hall. It was always shut, not because I was hiding anything, but because I hadn't gotten around to making it into anything useful yet. But there was something about it that caught my attention now. The door wasn't fully closed. It was just ajar, the faintest crack between the frame and the wall. I hadn't noticed it before, but now, as I sat there, it seemed oddly out of place. I set my book down and walked over to the door. The house was old, and the doors had a tendency to shift a little with the changing weather, so it wasn't unusual for them to not latch properly. I reached for the doorknob and gently pushed it open, expecting to find a draft or maybe some small thing that had caused the door to shift out of place. But as I opened it, a wave of cold air rushed out from the room. It wasn't like the regular chill from the outside air, it was deeper, almost unnatural. The room inside was dark, the light from the hallway casting long shadows across the walls, but I didn't see anything that would explain the sudden drop in temperature. I stood there for a moment, staring into the darkness of the room. It was so quiet, too quiet, and it felt as though the house itself had gone still, holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in there, something I couldn't see, and it made my heart beat just a little faster, but I shook it off. It's nothing, I told myself, just the house settling, just your imagination. I pulled the door shut, the soft click of the latch sounding louder than it should have. As I went back to the couch, trying to push the feeling out of my mind, but it lingered. I sat back down, but now the house didn't feel the same. The air felt thicker, colder. I glanced back down the hallway, my eyes drawn to the door again, even though I tried not to focus on it. But then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper just barely above the sound of my breathing. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it was clear enough to send a shiver down my spine. I froze. I thought it was a trick of the wind, maybe the house creaking in the night. But then I heard it again, softer this time, as though someone was standing just behind the door, speaking in a voice too low for me to fully hear. My heart thudded in my chest. The whispering didn't make sense. I was alone in the house, no one else was here. I stood up again, my legs unsteady beneath me, and walked slowly down the hallway toward the door. I tried to steady my breath, telling myself that it was nothing, that I was overthinking things. But as I approached the door, the whispering stopped. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob, unsure of whether to open it again. The silence around me was oppressive, thick with something I couldn't quite name. I reached for the knob, and as I did, I felt a cold gust of air brush past me, stronger this time, as though something was moving behind the door just beyond my reach. My skin tingled and I hesitated. I didn't want to open it again, but something in me urged me to, so I did. I opened the door slowly, the faint creak of the hinges sounding unnaturally loud. The room was dark just as I had left it, and for a moment I thought maybe the chill and the whispering had been nothing more than my imagination. But then I saw it, the shadow. It wasn't anything solid, not a person or a figure, but it was unmistakable. A dark shape lingering in the corner of the room, almost as though it were crouched, waiting. It was the kind of shadow that seemed to breathe, moving with the shift of light from the hallway. I couldn't look away. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering started again, but this time it wasn't soft. It was clearer, like someone was right next to me, their voice just behind my ear. I couldn't make out the words, but the urgency in the tone was unmistakable. My mind raced, panic threatening to overwhelm me, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, but I stood frozen in place, my feet glued to the floor. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the whispering stopped. The shadow in the room disappeared and the air seemed to return to normal. I stood there for a long time, my mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. The house felt the same as it had before, quiet and still. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just seen something that wasn't supposed to be there. I left the room, closed the door, and locked it. I didn't go back in. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, of hearing that whisper again just beyond the edge of my hearing. The next day I tried to convince myself that it had all been a trick of the mind, but I knew better. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the same anymore. Every time I walked down the hallway, I could feel the door calling to me, the shadow waiting behind it. I never opened it again. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear it, that whisper, soft and low, just behind the door. And I can't help but wonder if something is still waiting in the room, just out of sight, waiting for me to listen again. It was one of those quiet nights when everything feels still, like the whole world is asleep and you're the only one awake. I had just moved into a new apartment, a small second-floor unit in an older building on the edge of town. The place was modest but had a certain charm, with its high ceilings, creaky floors, and windows that let in the soft, cool breeze of early autumn. The first few nights had been peaceful. The sounds of the city below faded into the background, and I had settled into a routine, coming home from work, making dinner, and winding down before bed. The apartment felt like a place of solitude, a space where I could escape the noise of everything else. That night, however, something felt different. The air in the apartment was heavier, the silence a little too thick. I'd just finished unpacking the last of my boxes and was getting ready for bed when I heard it, a faint sound, barely perceptible, but there nonetheless. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the usual creaks and groans of an old building. But then I heard it again, a whisper, soft but distinct, coming from somewhere in the room. It was so faint that I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakable. My name, or at least something close to it, whispered into the silence. I froze, standing there in the dim light of the living room, unsure if I had imagined it. I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the apartment was empty. No one was there. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that it was the quiet of the night playing tricks on me. The apartment was old, after all, and old buildings have a way of making strange noises. I went to bed that night, still uneasy, but eventually drifted off, the sound of the whisper lingering in the back of my mind. The next evening, I tried to shake off the strange feeling, determined not to let it bother me. I had a friend coming over for dinner, and we spent the evening laughing and talking, the apartment filled with the warmth of companionship. But as the night drew on and my friend left, I was left alone with the familiar stillness of the apartment once more. The air felt thick again, almost suffocating, and that same unease I had felt the night before returned. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that everything was fine, that it was just the silence of living alone. That's when I heard it again, the whisper. This time it was clearer, more distinct. It was coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom door, so faint that it almost blended with the low hum of the refrigerator. But it wasn't the refrigerator. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, my name. As I stood up, my heart racing, and walked toward the door. I knew I was alone, but the voice was so real, so clear. I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the doorknob, wondering if I should open the door or just call out. But then the whisper came again, louder now, clearer. Come here. I froze, the blood in my veins turning cold. My instincts told me to open the door to investigate, but my body wouldn't move. Something in me was telling me that I didn't want to know what was on the other side. The voice wasn't threatening, it wasn't angry, but there was something in it that felt wrong, as though it didn't belong in my apartment, in my space. The words weren't comforting, they were an invitation, a lure, but to what? I stood there in silence, the quiet of the apartment pressing in on me. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the room was holding its breath, waiting for me to act. Finally, I summoned enough courage to open the door just a crack. I peeked into the hallway, but there was nothing there. The apartment was empty. The hallway was dark, the shadows stretching out in the low light just as it had been moments ago. I stepped out into the hall, my feet almost making no sound on the old floorboards. The silence was almost oppressive, heavier than it had been before. My breath seemed too loud as I slowly walked down the hallway, trying to keep my movements steady, trying to convince myself that there was a logical explanation. But I couldn't explain the whispering. I couldn't explain how real it had felt, how it had seemed to come from somewhere, someone just out of sight. I made my way toward the kitchen, checking the windows, the doors, anything that might explain the feeling of being watched. But nothing, everything was as it should be. The refrigerator hummed softly in the corner, the moonlight filtering in through the curtains. I stood there for a moment, the weight of the silence pressing down on me again. And then, just as I turned to go back to my bedroom, I heard it once more. The whisper. This time it wasn't in the hallway. It was behind me close. I could feel it in the air, the words almost brushing against my ear. Stay, it said, clear as day. I whipped around, my heart racing in my chest, but again there was nothing. The room was empty, the shadows unchanged. I was alone, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. The whisper was real. I could feel it in my bones, deep in my chest, like a presence, something just beyond my reach. I backed into the living room, the urge to flee growing stronger with each passing second, but I couldn't leave. Something was keeping me here, something I couldn't explain. I decided to leave the apartment to get some fresh air and clear my head, but even as I left, the whispering stayed with me. It followed me just beneath the surface of my thoughts, as if it were waiting for me to come back. And when I returned, I didn't feel alone anymore. The whispering didn't stop. It was always there, just beyond hearing, waiting for me to listen. Sometimes it was my name, sometimes it was just a soft, unintelligible murmur. but it was always there, hanging in the air like a shadow. To this day, I still don't know what it was or why it followed me. I tried everything I could think of to get rid of it, cleansing the space, even moving to a new apartment, but the whispers never truly stopped. They still follow me sometimes, just behind my ear, soft and quiet, like a distant memory. I hear them when the house is still, when the world is silent, and I know that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting for me to listen. There's something deeply unsettling about the quiet of night, isn't there? The way everything around you seems so still, so peaceful, and yet the silence itself can be so heavy. We go through our days lost in the noise of the world, but when the sun sets and the world quiets down, it feels as though the shadows stretch just a little further. There's a weight to the silence, a reminder that not everything can be explained. Perhaps that's why these stories, these whispers, call to us. They remind us that there are things we don't always understand, things that follow us even when we think we're alone. I imagine you know that feeling, the one that creeps up your spine, quiet and insistent, like something is just out of sight, just behind you, waiting. We've all heard it at some point, that voice or that sound that seems too real to ignore, yet too strange to understand. It's the same voice that keeps us up at night, wondering if the world around us is truly as it seems. And maybe that's the thing about fear. It's not always the loudest or the most obvious. Sometimes it's the quietest, the softest thing, like a whisper in the dark. As you drift off tonight, remember, the quiet can be just as loud as the noise. And though the stories end, the whispers don't always fade. There's always another corner of the world, always another shadow waiting for someone to listen. If you ever want to hear more, to feel the soft presence of the unseen, I'll be here, sharing the stories that keep us awake in the quiet of the night. So until then, sleep well. Let the darkness stay at bay, but remember, the whispers are never far and they always find a way to return.